Great. Well, thank you everyone for joining here today, this morning. I'm really excited to share this with you. My name is Colin Ash. I work for Associated Insurance and Risk Management Advisors, and I run our risk management consulting practice here. And today what we're going to do is we're going to cover experience modifications, essentially what they are, how they work, and how they ultimately can cost or save you money on your workers' compensation premium. And a little bit as an interlude here, as many of us have probably seen here in the past year, 2, 3 years, is a hardening insurance market. And that's really stemming from property insurance, umbrella insurance, and auto insurance, as well as management liability. And when you have these rates increasing and insurance costs going up, all else equal, there's really limited opportunity sometimes to really find savings within your insurance program. So what I'll be sharing with you today is not only how an experience modification is calculated, the data that goes into it, et cetera, but really the goal is to help you better understand how you can take advantage of experience modifications to save you money on your insurance premium and your total cost of risk. So before getting started, what I'll do is I'm going to start a poll here, and hopefully all you can see this. So just wanted to get a baseline of everyone's level of understanding here. Do you know what an experience mod is? It's good. I see some familiar names on this webinar. I also see some new names, so this is great to see. Thank everyone for joining. I'll give it a few more moments here before I close it out. All right. Okay, so it looks like a number of people do know what their experience mod is, so that's great, but we have a few that also don't, so that's fine too. Hopefully today you'll get a better understanding of what that looks like. All right, so we'll get into the meat and potatoes of this presentation now. So we're going to start here with a agenda. First and foremost, we'll go through what NCCI is. Essentially, that's who actually puts together experience modifications for the states that participate. Then we'll go through what an experience modification is, how it impacts premium, the data that's included, how they're calculated, and ultimately, and most importantly, how we can use them to save money on your insurance premium. So just to get a baseline here of what we're working with, the National Council on Compensation Insurance, so that's NCCI, is effectively an organization that collects payroll and loss information from insurance companies. And their whole purpose is essentially to make sure that the workers' compensation system in the states that participate is essentially fair and has adequate rate making, right? So their goal is to pretty much say, look, insurance companies, we understand you guys need to be able to make a profit for this whole thing to work. So we want to make sure you make some money, but we also want to make sure it's fair for the people that have to purchase workers' compensation insurance and make sure they're not being charged exorbitantly high rates. Right, so essentially what happens is every single year, insurance companies that have policies in NCCI states submit their insured's payroll and loss information to NCCI for analysis. NCCI uses that data to essentially create rates as well as to make experience modifications for those companies, right? So many of you have probably seen an experience modification worksheet. It usually says NCCI at the top, and it comes from them, and they're the ones that actually put your experience modification together. So an experience modification is essentially just a ratio, right? So it's a coefficient that compares your own company's quote unquote actual losses versus the expected losses NCCI would anticipate you would have based upon the payroll that you have as a company and the class codes that you have as a company, right? Since it's just a ratio, it effectively acts as a coefficient. So it could be greater than 1, it could be less than 1, or equal to 1. So if your experience modification ends up being less than 1, that is telling you that you have actually done better than your average industry peer from a workers' compensation loss perspective. For instance, if your experience modification is 0.90, that means you've done about 10% better than average. Conversely, if you have an experience modification over 1, let's say it's 1.10, that means you're doing about 10% worse than your average industry peer, right? So you're actually lagging behind them, not only from a loss perspective, but also from a cost perspective on workers' compensation insurance. And then sometimes this is the case, your experience modification would actually equal one. That essentially means that's your par for the course, right? You are setting the average for your industry and you're doing no better and no worse than your industry competitors. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch another poll here and just asking you all, if you know what that is, what is your company's experience modification for workers' compensation? We'll leave this open here for a little bit. The answers coming through now. This is great. Okay. Looks like it's slowing down now. I'll just end it. So I see some folks, not too many people less than 0.75. We've got most people in the 0.75 to 1, as well as the 1.01 to 1.25, and then not too many people over 1.25 and a few not sure's. That's great. Totally expected. People's experience modifications fall all over the place. So again, if you have one that's less than 1, that means you're doing better than average, and we'll get into what that means for your insurance premium here in a moment. And if you have a greater than 1 experience mod, that means you're actually being penalized a little bit and maybe paying a little bit more, but we'll get into some more detail about how that works here in a second. So we're going to talk about how your experience mod actually impacts the premium you pay for workers' compensation insurance. So as I mentioned before, an experience mod is a coefficient, but it really acts as a multiplier that increases or decreases the cost of your workers' comp insurance. And I'll give you 2 examples here. So let's say the insurance company charges you $100,000 based upon your payroll and the class codes you have for your company for that payroll. So that's your base premium, right? Your pure premium. Now let's imagine you have an experience mod of 1.30, right? So that means you're essentially 30% worse than average from a loss perspective compared to your average industry peer. So what they would do, the insurance company takes that $100,000 in premium, they multiply it by 1.3, and your actual premium you have to end up paying is $130,000, right? So you're actually paying $30,000 more for your workers' compensation insurance than your insurance company and NCCI actually thinks is your exposure, right? They're penalizing you effectively for your poor experience in the past. In example number 2 is a similar example, but an example of when an experience modification is below 1, right? So that same $100,000 of pure premium, but let's imagine your experience modification instead is a 0.70. Again, same multiplication happens. They take the 100,000, multiply it by 0.7, and you actually get a reward for how good your loss experience has been, and your final premium ends up being $70,000. So this is obviously a much better price to be paying for the same amount of actual payroll exposure than the above example, right? So your loss history has been so good that the insurance company is actually rewarding you for it and giving you a discount. Again, it's the same company, same payrolls, but one's paying more, one's paying less, and you can see where one company has an advantage over the other. I'm going to start another poll here. And in this poll, it's kind of leading into our next discussion here. Let me launch it. And it's asking what costs are actually included in the loss data for your experience mod. Select all that apply, right? So what items actually go into the loss information that your insurance company sends over to NCCI to include in your experience mod? Is it medical expenses? Is it lost time wages, permanency awards potentially, legal fees, or all the above? Getting some answers rolling in here. With a few more seconds for a few more answers. Okay. End the polling here. So we have a lot of folks in the lost time wages. That's good. We have a few with medical expense, that's great. Permanency awards, good. Legal fees, okay. And we have a lot of people in all the above, as expected, which is totally fine. So in reality, the only items actually included, let's switch to the next slide here. The only items included in the losses for your experience mod are going to be medical expenses. So when people go to the hospital, physical therapy, surgeries, those sorts of things. Lost time benefits. So that includes wages for missed time from work while they're on modified duty, light duty, or off duty, as well as permanency awards for any settlements that happen, for loss of use of a hand, loss of use of body as a whole, those sorts of things. Expenses, so you can think of legal fees and other expenses incurred like investigation fees, those sorts of things are actually not included in the losses for your experience mod because they're kind of considered discretionary, and insurance companies have different fee schedules for those sorts of things, depending on the legal firms they use. So they leave that information out, right? So it's only going to be your medical expenses, lost time costs, as well as permanency awards. As far as the data actually included in your experience mod, and this is a general kind of best, or most often this is the case, your experience modification includes 3 years of payroll information and 3 years of loss data, excluding the current policy period. So I have an example here below. Let's imagine we have a company with a renewal date for their workers' compensation insurance of 10/1/2021. Right, so what happens is the data actually included on that policy's experience modification is going to be the loss and payroll data for the 17/18 policy, the 18/19 policy, and the 19/20 policy. The loss and payroll information on the 1920 or the 2020, the 2020 and 2021 policies are not included on the experience modification for the 2021 experience mod because that policy is incomplete when the experience mod is actually finalized. And this is the date that NCCI uses on 4/1/2021. So effectively, your experience modification, if your policy renews on 10/1/2021, your experience mod is finalized 6 months prior to renewal. That is why they don't include that current policy period, because it's incomplete. So that's an important date to remember because that's the actual dates of losses that they use for your experience modification as well. I'm going to keep moving forward here. So here's, again, the actual formula for how experience mods are calculated. There's actual losses and expected losses, and I put, again, quotes around actual losses because when I say actual losses, there's actually something else going on here. So you have your actual losses, right? So this is how many medical expenses and how much lost time wages were paid out. But there's also this stabilizing factor, which is pretty much something you can never get rid of. Even if you have 0 actual losses, you're always going to have the stabilizing factor. The stabilizing factor is smaller for bigger companies and bigger for smaller companies to pretty much hopefully stabilize the experience of those two types of entities. And then expected losses, it's the same thing. What NCCI would expect your losses to be based upon your class codes and your payrolls, and then that same stabilizing factor. So that's actually what goes into the ratio. Okay, I'll keep moving forward. So as far as how mods are actually calculated, I'm going to go a little bit deeper into the expected losses piece, right? So the denominator. Effectively, what NCCI does is they take the payroll that you have for an individual class code and they multiply that payroll by an expected loss rate that they've come up with for that class code to get your expected losses. And then they add all those numbers up to get your full company's expected losses. So the loss rate for an individual class code is based upon the loss data for that class code that NCCI compiles for all of the people that have that class code in your state. And then what happens is that expected loss is actually split into both primary losses and excess losses. And I'm about to speak to that in a moment. But before I do, let me share another poll here. I will be launching it here in one moment. So we're going to be talking about primary and excess losses. And I want to ask you all, what do you think hurts your mod more? one $50,000 claim, or 10 $5,000 claims? Oh man, it looks like we have a few experts on our webinar here today. I thought this was going to trip people up. Okay, give it a few more seconds here. All right. So most people did answer correctly. So actually, that's not true. Most people actually answered incorrectly here. So we have most of the answers in 10 $5,000 claims hurts your mod more. And then a few answers in one $50,000 claim hurts your mod more. So I'm going to switch my slide here. And we'll talk a little bit here about primary versus excess losses. So essentially, to answer everyone's question, because of, and I'll explain this in a second, because of discounting for excess losses, frequency actually hurts your mod more than severity, right? So you would, all else equal, would rather have one $50,000 claim rather than 5 or 10 $5,000 claims. And the reason why that is because NCCI splits losses into two pieces, primary and excess. And the split point happens, it's currently set at, it is currently set at $18,000. But this changes from year to year by about $500. Usually it goes up. And currently, anything below that split point is considered primary. Anything above it is considered excess. And excess losses above the split point are discounted by a weighting factor, which changes for every company. A lot of times you'll see it be 0.2, 0.18, 0.3. And essentially what happens is that full amount of loss below the primary threshold is counted 100%. Anything above it is discounted by, it could be 80%, as I mentioned before, it could be 60%, it could be 90%, depends on the company, but excess losses hurt you much less. So NCCI essentially punishes you for frequency of losses more than they do for severity. I have one more poll here that I'll launch in a moment before we get into the next slide, and this will lead us into our next discussion. Okay, how much are medical-only losses discounted? So when I say medical-only, that means they don't receive any lost time wages from work. They, in a lot of states, the waiting period might be 2 days, it might be 3 days, so they don't miss that more than that amount of days from work. So how much are medical-only losses discounted? 10%, 25%, 70%, or not at all? Give it a few more moments here. Okay, all right, kind of all over the board. We have a lot of numbers. We have 10%, 25, 70, pretty evenly distributed actually. So good news is medical only losses are actually discounted by 70%. So if we look at this, this is a really strong incentive essentially to have your employees return to work before that waiting period expires. So medical only claims are discounted by 70%. What that means is if you have a $10,000 medical only claim, the only $3,000 of it will actually be included on your experience bond, which is pretty awesome, right? So if you can keep a claim to be medical only and the worker returns to work within the waiting period, you'll save yourself 70% on that claim when it comes to your experience modification. Conversely, lost time claims have 100% of the cost included in the experience bond. So if someone only goes over that waiting period by 2 or 3 days, well, guess what? You just missed out on that 70% discount. You're now paying 100% for all of those losses on your experience bond. So effectively, the quicker you can get folks back to work, obviously in a medically safe way, the less money it's going to cost you on your insurance. Okay. So we're going to talk about this a little bit. This is ultimately the kind of firm wrap up to the different ways you can use your experience modification, how it's calculated to ultimately save you money. Right, so first and foremost, you want to keep your claims to be medical only whenever possible. If you can avoid having someone go past that waiting date in your state, to return to work, you're going to save yourself a lot of money on workers' compensation insurance. To do this, you can institute an early return to work program, right? So even if you can't, obviously sometimes people have to miss time from work. If you have an early return to work program, to at least try to get them back to work as soon as they can, and instead of having them off of work 6 months, you only have them off of work for 3 months, that can save you a lot of money as well. So an early return to work program can provide a lot of benefits. You can also help try to identify causes of some of your costly claims and treat that risk. For instance, if you're a medical facility and you have a lot of lifting injuries or patient and resident handling injuries where people are trying to transfer patients out of beds, they're trying to help them get to the bathroom, those sorts of things, and people are getting a lot of injuries from them, you could try to come up with a way to help mitigate and treat that risk, whether it's total avoidance with automation using lift assists, or with PPE, or with training, really trying to identify what those causes are and then treat the risk so that hopefully you have less types of those losses. Another thing that's really important to do, and we encourage people to do this strongly, is you want to have a claim file review meeting with your insurance company and your broker before a unit stat filing date. So as I mentioned before, 6 months before your renewal date is when your experience month is actually calculated, and that's when the data is finalized. You want to make sure your losses look as good as possible on that day. In order to do that, you want to make sure that reserves are adequate and not over the top. You want to make sure that you can close out any claims that might be able to before that date so that your losses look as good as possible on that date. So you want to have that meeting with your insurance company and your broker before that unit stat filing date. And then lastly, it's really good to have your insurance broker auditing your experience mod to find errors and cost-saving opportunities. So many times, I would say, on over half of the experience mod worksheets I look at, there's an error on it, whether it's an administrative error with a number being wrong, a company's name being wrong at the top, or an error in losses, right? Sometimes they have the wrong number there, or maybe the claim is closed to be better than it was actually reserved for on your experience modification worksheet. You can actually go back and try to get those cost savings from your insurance company back. So you really want to make sure your insurance company, your insurance broker is auditing your experience mod to find errors and to find cost saving opportunities. So I'll just have one last polling question with everyone here. Let me launch this. And this is just a good thing to think about from an early return to work perspective. What type of early return to work options exist for your employees? You have off-duty, light and modified duty, not-for-profit transitional duty. Perfect. Okay. We're good. So we have a lot of light duty, modified duty, some not-for-profit transitional duty. I think this is a good one just to highlight. So if you don't have a return to work opportunity for an employee based upon what their restrictions are from their doctor, you can always reach out to your insurance company and see if they have placement options available for that employee at a not-for-profit temporarily. A lot of times these insurance companies will partner with someone like the Red Cross, and that employee can go there and you'll pay them to work at the Red Cross doing whatever small administrative tasks that they can end up doing. So it's a really good way to still have someone return to work in a different way than having come back to your facility in particular, but it's a great cost savings opportunity as well. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining today. My contact information is listed here at the end. If you have any questions about your experience modification in particular, anything I covered on today's webinar, or as a thank you for attending today, I'd be happy to do an experience modification audit for anyone that would like it, and I'll send an email with some of the details afterward with what that would entail and the type of information we would need. But thank you all for joining today, and I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks, everyone.